Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Njuguna. I'm an undergraduate student at Harvard and Boston University. It's a pleasure to see you all. My title research is related to Opium War. Is research I've done with a Harvard professor over the culmination in my last year in high school and some time in my college year as well. It was a very fun project to learn about the Opium Wars and meeting tea and kind of leaders at that point in time. And I will get into it. As you can see in the slide as well, you'll probably see it's kind of relatively bare. I hope you talk mainly in this to have a little bit more dialogue with you guys. But yeah. So just to give contribution, my professor was Kendra Malapalli. I apologize if you see him butcher your name. He's a professor at the South Asian Institute at Harvard. He was mainly my supervisor and professor and kind of mentor throughout the entire process. His dedication towards it and his study in the time of Opium Wars was very amazing, honestly. It helped me understand the culture and also historical significance throughout the entire period. Additionally, I just want to thank also my family, friends, my mom, everyone cast supporting this project. It was a very lengthy research project, which included finding first-hand accounts with the Harvard College at Wynot Library, with the governor of Hong Kong, prime minister, and other major accountants at that time, which helped me kind of overlay a kind of understanding of kind of the Opium Wars. With that being said, I'll just start right now. So introduction about the Opium Wars. When we think about global conflicts, what do you think about triggers in global conflicts? Many kind of attribute the Opium Wars to opium, hence the name. Typically with the Qing Dynasty stance with it. As many of us know, the stance of opium was very restrictive and kind of firm, there being that no opium should enter Chinese ports or cities or territories whatsoever, and that was just a red flag and red line for them. And China, specifically the East India Company, kind of skirted those rules. And we'll look at more of those rules as a time, but however, we don't understand that tea was the prime motivation towards that due to high trade deficits and increasingly restrictive policies. And we'll go in that as well. There are several stances towards this argument as well. We have one that goes to one side, which is very far, which is Britain's right of defense and kind of policy towards it. And also goes to imperialism as well. Was this imperialist policy that Britain imposed on China? These are two different stances that are typically one of the most hard polarizing points of it. There are middle stances and some slightly to the side and the left. So these are stances we want to look at on both sides, some authors as well on these stances as well. So some background really fast. The Canton system was used by the Qing Dynasty. Essentially, it was a point of one port, one control policy, essentially. It would go to the Canton port, where all trade of foreign individuals would go to that port exactly. No matter if you were British, French, or whatever kind of nationality you were, every port goes to one system and goes to one merchant system and guild, which is the Kohan Guild. As a result, this may have not been the worst policy initially if you're trying to trade China, because China did have a lot of luxury items at this point. However, it would be a problem if one of your largest domestic imports was from China, and that the only way they want to trade with you is from silver. As you can see, this happened in Britain. Britain's tea consumption grew explosively throughout the ages. Typically, tea became both a luxury good to a mass consumer good, where individuals within mostly almost all income levels could purchase tea at this point. And this resulted in one of the most economic explosive growth in Britain for tea. The problem is that most of the tea imports did come from China at this point, and the result of this was a lot of economic pressure with the East India Company from silver. China wanted silver in exchange for resources and trade goods. They didn't really accept any other kind of foreign items. As a result, tea was very lucrative for them. And as a result, the East India Company had to essentially use a lot of reserves in the silver reserves, including the British Parliament as well, to buy these goods. The problem is, as tea growth and demand kept growing, the silver demands did drain, and it was a very economic stance at a point. Problem had to have debates on the issue of the fact was the system economically viable? And the problem is, it was not. The problem is, you can't just simply stop demand. It's not how economics work, unfortunately. Demand will keep going up no matter if supply is low. The only way you can kind of control demand is increasing the cost of supply. The problem is demand was not going down. So, as we know that, there are two arguments made on this as well. The British actions, one debate is the British actions were unwarranted and imperialistic. One action essentially is that after the culmination of British belief that this system wasn't working, using opium essentially to purchase silver, in turn to buy tea with the East India Company, one action was that these actions were imperialistic and unwarranted, simply saying that these actions were simply the action of Britain trying to impose their will and authority on a sovereign nation. Another attitude is that China's attitudes were overstepping and were forcing conflict between Britain. These two stances come originally mainly from the belief that China was actually making it impossible for Britain to kind of trade with them. And this was not totally unwarranted. China did have a very antagonistic stance towards foreign trade. They believed that foreign trade was a very risky venture and could lead to China's subjugation and also or foreign influence as well, which is not totally unfounded, as we can see that trade was simply a very lucrative thing for imperialistic powers at this point in Europe. So it's not entirely unwarranted to see how they may feel this way. At the same time, though, people also believe at the same time that China's actions were simply overstepping, and the conflict that they were using for this, the catalyst, essentially not giving them an avenue, or kind of open discussion towards an open avenue towards their current predicament, was forcing conflict. So we see here two authors I put. Harry Gelbler is a historian, a major historian that went to Harvard, Boston University, other colleges as well, including London School of Economics as well, and wrote essentially China as a victim. This is probably the stance that goes in towards China's actions against Britain overstepping. It was mainly saying that China's stances towards them was overstepping their bounds as a foreign state. And doing these actions kind of forced conflict on Britain's hand, and that Britain's conflict was, as stated, warranted in their opinion. Another opinion here, which is C. Summers. Now, this author is relatively new. She just graduated in 2016 from Harvard University. But I think it's very important to see because this is a new generation of scholar now, and it's good to see the stance on this. Now, her stance is on the British stance. Britain was unwarranted and imperialistic, stating that it was Britain's right to kind of have the system in place, and as a result, Britain's actions in using opium as essentially a legal and illicit drug to purchase silver in order to buy tea was imperialistic and kind of was very much in a point of wrong, especially when you consider Britain's moral stance in its state of empire, which was essentially the ethical state of the empire was to promote moral good and to essentially be a symbol of humanity at this point. You can almost assume that by Britain. You can also see that through the end of slave trade. It's both more traditional policies. So there are very different stances on this topic, and there's only two major ones I found and used in my research. You'll find plenty more on both sides and even in the middle as well. But these are arguments that should be taken to review both sides because they're both very important to understand kind of significance here. We're now going to go to tea imports. As you can see, the quote I put here is "Tea is the opiate of the English masses," kind of from Karl Marx, simply saying that original opium is opium in English masses. The reason why we say this, the reason why I'm saying this is because tea at this point, to understand, was extremely lucrative at this point, and it's only grown since then in modern day. To give you reference, this is the opium trade in peak in 1868, which is about 10,000 pounds, a little close to 11,000 if I round it up. Which is relatively high, I would say. 10,000 pounds is a lot of pounds. However, if you overlay this with the peak tea trade, which is also in the middle of the Opium Wars, you can see that tea is 35 million pounds, which is extremely high. As you can see here, especially if you take economic sense in it, you can see that the economic priority of Britain at this point was essentially to secure tea, mainly because the increase in economic poundage of tea was growing to a massive scale. While opium, actually, if you look in my research article that you may have read, was actually falling at this point, which was probably one of the biggest contrasts here. And I just kind of put this up there to kind of show the contrast of it and kind of the scale of how much tea was imported in Britain at this time. It's only grown up as well. Just a quick fact, tea imports in Britain is currently around 220 million pounds annually, which is way more than this now. While opium imports are obviously probably zero by British government standards. So as you can tell, tea was simply a motivating factor in an economic standpoint by Britain because they did need to secure this kind of tonnage within the economic system because tea was the major ground factor and kind of promoter within the economic system within Britain. Without tea, Britain would not really stand an economic viable chance. Without opium, it would just mean silver would have to be procured another way, which, as you can see here, are two different aspects, where a primary factor of getting tea between the secondary factor of opium kind of contrasts the main reason of the Opium Wars. And now we go to trade restrictions here. A question is, why China have these policies in place? I know we talked about it a little bit, but mainly it was a couple reasons here. A trade deficit was occurring in this policy. China, again, believed that this was against pressure against pressure against Britain and other foreign powers that kind of want to, in a view, impose influence in Britain. It was a fear that this kind of action would cause the government of China, the Qing dynasty, to be influenced by foreign powers, and it would almost be a subject at this point. That was what he kind of feared at this point, and the emperor feared at this point, and kind of made policies and very hard policies against the influence of foreign nations. This resulted in trade deficit, obviously with the system as well. This was a very bad trade deficit, and as you see, silver was rapidly being drained from the imperial reserves by Britain. And like I said, it became to a point where Parliament had to have debates on this issue as well, on is this system viable for anyone, if not Britain itself? And as a result, the trade deficit kind of imposed almost a factual need by Britain to kind of resolve this issue one way or another. Additionally, China's policies coupled with increased pressure against opium. Now, the policies China placed on them, including crackdowns against opium, because they weren't blind to this, they did know opium was being funneled by Britain, at least the East India Company, to China to get silver in return. These policies were very restrictive. This included closing ports, earthing officials, even restricting more trade with Britain at this point, or placing more increased restrictions in Britain. This, as you can see, put Britain and the EIC, the East India Company, in a hard place in Iraq. Because you see, you can't simply just get tea in one point and then not have silver to pay for it. Either they had to use opium as a funnel or a medium to get silver to buy tea, or they had to find this one way. And at this point, there was no economically viable way in Britain to gain this kind of amount of silver to buy tea. Opium was considered one of the best ways to do it at this point for the East India Company, because at the end of the day, it is a company trying to get money and profit in the system. It's losing money, it's not doing the right thing in their opinion. And opium was seen as a great way to do that. However, with these policies now in place, it became increasingly difficult by the East India Company and Britain to kind of procure this amount, because it's one thing to have silver being a mandatory resource, but it's another thing to have an economic pressure on both sides of the avenue placed upon you. So these policies on why they're in place was mainly to kind of dictate China's control in a way. They believe that, again, that foreign trade and influence was a violation, or at least a threat to the Chinese government, and therefore try to reduce it as much as they can. And the best way to do it is through trade. The less trade you have, the less influence they can have in your country, and vice versa, right, in that avenue as well. So that way, trade was restricted, and with tea being something a lucrative resource, they had to put a lot of restrictions on this point in their eyes to kind of prevent this kind of threat as they face it right now. Prevention of war, though, we've talked about a lot about the war and kind of tea and opium, but a lot of people do ask is how could it have been prevented? And you have a lot of opinions on this. One very common one is that why not have fair trade practices? And this is not an entirely unfounded point. If China did see Britain was getting more antagonistic against Chinese will and was willing to get tea, almost increasingly demanding tea at this point, why not just have fair trade practices? Why not open more ports? Why not just have different ports of avenue so you can reduce pressure on Britain so you don't have to go to, as we all know, military means to kind of get this kind of point across? Now this can be both, you can have both good sides on this. One avenue is that China did not view this as a valid policy. Having fair trade practices means having both sides give and take. China mainly wanted to simply take and did not want to give a lot of control to Britain. Having one port already was seen as a very risky venture by the Qing dynasty. So you can already see that giving more ports or more avenues of control to Britain was simply not feasible in their eyes. And the fair trade practice, although would have provided prevented war, is just simply not possible for the Qing dynasty. And as you see, had to use military means to kind of open up 5 more ports and cede Hong Kong in order to kind of force more economic ventures with Britain to China. You can also do strengths. We can go right into the war here. The war, as you can tell, is very one-sided. China and Britain's military comparison is not very valid. At this point in time, while Britain typically had more advanced military professionalism, manpower, and equipment and technology, China typically had to use more imposement military personnel, whether that be farmers, elder staff, or personnel, or even villages kind of running their own defense against Britain. As a result here, the strength difference resulted in, even though China did have manpower comparison far greater than Britain's, it did result in essentially Britain almost winning every single conflict, especially naval conflict. China didn't have really a standing navy at this point, while the Britain did have actually some of the most advanced navy at this point. Resulted in naval battles, victories, and conflicts essentially being victored by Britain. And at this point, you can see another argument here is why not have a military deterrence against Britain? If you're China, you can obviously, well, Britain's going to be more antagonistic. They're going to probably pursue more different means. If I'm Britain, if I can't get them to trade practice-wise, if I can't buy tea another way, if I can't make tea a different way, why not just force tea with a military power if I have it at my disposal? The problem was with China, military power was simply not very feasible with them. And the problem is the amount of time, effort, and equipment they would need to do at this point was extensive. China kind of preferred an isolationist policy, and as a result, when it came to science, trade, lucrative items, or even technology, it was restrictive, and the technology progression rate was typically slowed at this point, including the stances of military advancement within China, unfortunately was not as up to par with European standards. As a result, the turn through strength was not a feasible policy at this point, because even though Britain did not want a war, to be frank with you, they did not want to have to spend another several £100 or £1 million on a war that could just potentially be detrimental, just ruin the economy at this point. They were forced to it. And when they did see they're winning and they could do it relatively well, this kind of changed the stance of, well, we shouldn't fight a war to maybe we can win this war and get maybe economic vengeance out of it. This kind of clashed with the fears of Western imperialism on China's view towards increasingly untenable imbalance. Britain did not want an imbalance of trade, and China feared Western imperialism invest in the country and kind of spread over the country into the point where they have no control, or at least diminished control of the country. When you ask if war can be prevented, it's a very hard thing to kind of describe, because we don't really know how ways could have been prevented at this point. We have ideas that we believe could have been good, but at this point you have to look at it in their eyes. China did not want to have any foreign trade within the country. Britain wanted tea at a reasonable price. This clashes both ideas, because one demanded more influence by the country, and another one at this point kind of forced a position that could not be untenable at this point. As you can see, prevention of war would have been very difficult. Not impossible, but you can see these are just two examples, as you can see here, of how you can prevent a war. And I did go a little bit into it within my document, in my article, but these are also just two options you can do, or two actions you can theoretically do to prevent war. And then finally, I'm going to wrap it up with modern day and similarities. As you can see, that this is not simply just something like, oh, it's history, just not going to really be relevant now. That's very incorrect. Trade is actually considered an element of national security still to this day in China. Trade is very important to China. As you can tell, trade, import and export in China is very important within the Chinese national government, the CCP. To a point where it's considered an element of national security, especially after the century of humiliation, the element of trade is so important to China, it's almost seen as a means of control for China at this point. When it comes to soft economic power, China does control a vast market of the export markets, and therefore can use that market to get their wills through soft power. This doesn't mean military means. You don't have to use a military threat or action to kind of coerce an enemy. They see that economic power, at least through trade, is very untenable, which is why you see a lot of markets kind of follow China's lead, or at least be dictated by China. Now this is a mixed result depending on who you ask and depending look at the numbers, but this is one element that has still bring to modern day. The other thing is a tight regulation by China's government. China is a hybrid, almost a hybrid socialist government, which means that there is some element of free trade in China. At the same point, it is still heavily regulated by China, and it can be simply controlled almost entirely by China. This kind of contrasts to other governments as well. Looking at Western states, you typically see a free economic stance towards them, with this limited government intervention, if there is any. China, the UK, France, Germany, they kind of prefer a stance of the free economics should be on its own, but we should have some intervention into it when it comes to regulation, threats of economic pressure, or other kind of situation that could harm the economy at this point. As you can see here, this regulation here by China's government still exists today. They believe regulation in the economy is still very important, which is not unfounded. They believe that they, for example, had a fully true free economy, to extent of maybe Western states, it could present another threat of imperialism or influence in the country, which China does not prefer they have. And this kind of goes to the next point: U.S. and trade relations with the USA. As you can see here, these relations are typically not good if you've seen the news, and this kind of ties into what I've kind of told in my research here as well. The problem is with this is that the relations with China and the USA are relatively a tense point. Exportation by China makes up a large amount of the US economy, but when it comes to rare equipment such as semiconductors, equipment technology, when it comes to those technologies, in terms of computing power and military technology, the USA does have advancement in that kind of point. And at this point, China is, and the US relations are typically stands on that point. They both want something they both kind of need, because both economies, to be honest, cannot exist without each other. They both are extremely linked, and decoupling, as has been coined in term, is going to, well, as you can tell, and if you look at the numbers, are just very unconceivable at this point. Now the problem is with this: China doesn't want influence that could prevent it from implementing its will. For example, let's say, theoretically, China wanted to conduct a military adventure, right, or military expenditure. The problem is the USA would probably intervene in that point, depending on how it stands on towards the adventure, and could, for example, impose military restrictions on in terms of military equipment, technology, other things that could be critical towards China's national security, and therefore put influence on China at this point, which is something that they would not like, which is why they refer to these 2 points here: regulation and element of national security of trade. Which is why China could, in theory, in exchange, impose sanctions or other tariffs on the United States, which we've seen today as well, and back and forth. These policies are used to kind of be means of control and prevent foreign influence within China, but also having an element of control, which is why Chinese trade and what they view of it is very centralized in China. They don't consider it something that can just simply be without, more than any state, in fact, because most of the economy is, unfortunately, is trade. They are not just a consumption economy like the United States. They're a massive export economy that exports massive resources towards every state in the world, honestly. And therefore, trade has become, as I've said before countless times, a security concern that has been throughout the ages of China, and will probably only grow, as you can see, as it grows throughout its entire lifetime, essentially. So in short, economic mediums like opium, I know it's a little weird U-turn, but economic means like opium did not drive the engine of conflict. The opium wars were not typically about opium. Instead, it was about tea being a national issue, forcing ideals to clash. Tea was important to the ideals that forced the topic of imperialism, foreign control, and then other ways of avenues towards procuring the element to force a conflict. Opium was simply a driver to get silver in order to procure tea. And as you can see here, trade can unfortunately force ideas to clash, which is something that we need to consider a lot in the modern day when it comes to trade. Whether it be something as trivial as maybe an Xbox, or maybe some other item, or something serious as semiconductors or computing power technology. These items can force ideals to clash and therefore bring hot topics to a flashpoint. Something we need to be worried about today. Although we are very linked to this economy today, it's not impossible to see that these expenditures of military conflict cannot be used to force these economic mediums to create flashpoints. And as a result, this is why I believe, and this is why in my thesis it does state that tea is most likely the primary role of this opium war, and this essentially why mediums like opium are just, again, mediums and should be almost called like the tea wars. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. These are my citations that I've used. They're also more in my thesis as well. Are there any questions, I believe? Are we lead to?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, come for a round of applause, please. Yeah, now time for any questions. I just want to start by asking you, where did this interest come from? It's a very niche very niche topic, and you clearly know so much about it in depth. So yeah, where did the inspiration come from?
Absolutely. I believe it came from, in high school, I loved history, and I kind of want to do something history related, even though I'm now an economic route, personally. I did love history, and I really did want to kind of pursue it. And when looking at research and topics, the Opium Wars came up with my professor, and what topic he was kind of writing about as well. And I thought that's a really good topic. He gave me articles to read, journals and publications of it, and I was thinking more as I read it tea is mainly the motivation factor. Tea is kind of like the driver of this war, not really opium. You know, opium is a big factor as well in the medium. As a result, we decided to work together on our research paper as I went into my college years, and this is the culmination essentially of it.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there any further venues that you wish to see within this research?
Say again?
Are there any further venues that you wish to explore within this research?
Any-
You've done it in such a comprehensive way already, but what further venues do you want to explore?
Oh, with the opium wars. Oh, yes. So I would say within this, I'd like to explore, again, trade is a big factor. I kind of want to see other avenues of how this can be applied to modern day. I touched it slightly on my research paper, but not to a point where I like to kind of say I'm finished with it. My professor is still very in touch with this topic as well. So I would say avenues I want to use the research for is typically monitor similarities and kind of looking at economic strain and power and how China mainly feels towards this kind of strain of economic influence, because we know it's not very pleasant with them. But I kind of want to see, when it comes to modern day, what's kind of the flashpoint that kind of forced it, because we all know that opium was typically the medium towards the flashpoint with tea, but then how can we apply it to modern day is semiconductors, that's the medium or the flashpoint, is maybe something as trivial as maybe consumer goods flashpoint. I think using that in modern day can help us kind of see what kind of trends are we looking at, because the past is ring true for us in the future, I'd say, and these actions that have occurred now, back then, still ring true, and we can use it to kind of overlay a pathway of, well, we see this in history, this will probably be a sense they kind of take towards when looking at two kind of comparing variables, basically, I would say. Yes?
And a quick one. Fascinating presentation, David. Well done to you. So as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, you used the word tea wars. And I'm just looking at India, where, tea and British colonial rule with tea was... so it's a fascinating way you're looking at that. Is it actually an opium war or is it a tea war, right? Now, I'm just thinking about it. I don't know what theoretical lens have you used for it. Possibly you could even look at the colonial theory and the post-colonial theory. And if you can just go to Google Scholar JS Tor, there's some fascinating work on colonial and post-colonialism and how that relates to the tea business and the imperialist business. And I'm just thinking from that perspective. No question, just a little comment on the side.
No, I appreciate the comment, and I think you're absolutely right as well. I think that looking at post and pre-colonialism is a very important topic, especially with tea. And I think that research on every kind of, because it's not just Britain and China. There are other countries like India, as you mentioned as well, which did have a factor in influence in this topic, and even past the opium wars. So I definitely look at that more as well on my part, and I really thank you for bringing it up to me. But I agree entirely that it's simply looking at post and pre is a very important projector in order to kind of understand more about this topic and research as well.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again, David.
Thank you very much.